Hello and welcome back to MLQ Replay. I'm Ethan Sturm. It's hard to believe, but we've reached the final episode of our show for the season because we have reached the final weekend of the season. MLQ Championship in Des Moines, Iowa is just 4 days away. We are all extremely hyped about it. It's going to be an incredible event. And we're here to preview it all, myself along with Nick Jablonski and Jack McGovern. Guys, we'll be there in under 100 hours, I think. We'll have the first games going. And, the way we're going to structure this episode, obviously, this is generally a recap show, so we need to restructure things a little bit. Each of us, before the show, has come up with 3 storylines for the weekend and then 1 hot take that we want to bring with us for the weekend. We're going to start with the storylines, kind of set the scene for what this weekend is going to be, and then we'll give some of our hot takes about how things might go in what's likely to be a really, really competitive MLQ championship. So we'll get right into it. Nick, I'm going to let you take it away. Give me your first storyline for the weekend.
Thanks, Ethan. My first storyline is going to be teams in new places. I mean, this year, especially, we're seeing teams in a location in the bracket that we haven't seen them before. And there's a ton of them. Right, we have KC bringing a large roster. They've played through the play-in bracket pretty traditionally, but this is the first time I think that they're bringing a full 21 to any MLQ championships, and they've made great runs throughout it. I do also think that Boston having to play in the morning for the first time ever is just a massive, massive storyline. This is a team that is so used to coming out and playing on Saturday afternoon. It's where they tend to play just in general. And the fact that they have to play arguably at 10 a.m. in the morning is a completely different thing for them. We're going to have Minneapolis for the first time since 2019 in the early play-in bracket. We're going to have Toronto in the quarterfinals, which is just a completely different situation. We have Chicago in the discussion for potential tournament winners. And I think the biggest one is we're going to see a Washington team that's not playing Austin in the quarterfinals to start the morning. What do you all think about those? Yeah. Which one do you want to latch onto?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's definitely something to say. And I think it kind of speaks to the hype that is this play-in bracket. The last few years, it's just been consistently Washington and Charlotte. Those are the teams that get out of the play-in bracket on Saturday morning. And before that, we had more teams getting out of the play-in bracket, but it was still heavily east skewed with a little bit of south skew to it as well. And this is a different type of bracket. This has the 3-time MLQ champion Boston team in it. This has the 2-time defending North Division champion Minneapolis in it. These are teams that usually spend their Saturdays resting up in the hotel and getting ready for a quarterfinal that, in Boston's case, they're generally heavily favored in. In Minneapolis' case, it's generally definitely a fight. Beyond that, like you said, this KC team, every year we've kind of wanted the full roster KC that we get so excited about all season, and we never get it at a championship. We get it this year. This NOLA team is very convincing as well. You keep working your way through. And Charlotte, as we said, has never missed a quarterfinal. Detroit is way feistier than they've been in past years and is returning to the championship, getting their first qualification earned in quite some time. So there's no easy outs. I think when you're talking about teams in new places, that's the thing I find most interesting. Jack, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really looking forward to this Washington-Toronto quarterfinal. Washington, what a breath of fresh air, not having to play Austin to begin the tournament, getting a bye to the quarterfinals, getting a favorable matchup. But if you're Toronto, you're thinking, we didn't bring our strongest roster to MLQ North Division championships. We worked through our depth, and now we have a chance to put out our best team and really go toe-to-toe with one of the top franchises in MLQ. I watched Team Canada play Team England in the quarterfinals at the IQA World Cup. It was a tough game. There's 9 players from that Team Canada squad who will be playing for Toronto. So I'm really excited to see what they can do. At their best, they're just a really tough defensive team. I think they're going to make Washington work for goals. I think they're going to try to slow down the game. So I'm excited for that new quarterfinal matchup as well, of course, as the play-in bracket.
Yeah, and you mentioned kind of the fact that Washington doesn't have to play Austin finally on Saturday night, what it might be setting up very likely, I think if the playing bracket breaks the way most people do, is a Boston-Austin matchup Saturday night, which means one of those two teams would not even be playing on Sunday at MLQ Championship for the first time ever, or I guess at least since the first season when Austin was not part of the league, and the tournament, I believe, was only one day long that season. But outside of that, it's never been a MLQ Sunday that didn't feature those two teams. I mentioned my focus on the play-in bracket, and I think kind of the storyline I really want to touch on, I touched on briefly here as we kind of move on to our next one, is can the South Division finally show up in a play-in bracket? Because the South, has always had a lot of swag, and it's been earned. They've won a lot of championships across a lot of different leagues, and not even just one team. There's been a lot of success from a lot of different programs. We talk about the San Antonio team and what so many of those young players did in USQ College, but it hasn't kind of worked out outside of Austin's success. In this play-in bracket, I believe in the last 2 years, we mentioned it's always been the East coming out. And even back, going back to 2019 when we had a slightly different play-in bracket format, I believe it was only San Antonio that came out in the South Division, though I could be slightly wrong there. But when it comes to looking at what these teams have to bring to the table, Kansas City is definitely a team that could make noise and get out of this bracket. They're finally full rostered. We've kind of seen them, hang with just about everybody in the division except Austin. And, that's not something that a lot of teams can do. But, they played San Antonio tough early in the season, basically had one game come down to a flag runner grab to decide that one. And obviously they get the sweep against a really good New Orleans team, and they do take down League City as well. There's depth in that quad ball game. They have a lot of players that can score. And, their dodgeball game that has been rocky at times in the past hasn't been able to hang with those younger players, with the Lauren Curry's coming in, with the Vincent Reyes's when he's playing beater coming in, alongside a player like Brian McClanahan, who's been such a stalwart rock, and a player like Justin DeWick, who hasn't played a ton this season, but who I think we expect to be making a difference at championship as well. This Kansas City team has a lot going for it. And then, you talk about a NOLA team that, is a fourth place team, not a team that, necessarily we ever expect to be favored to come out, but hung tough with everybody, even hung tough with Austin for some of those seeker floors that we haven't seen many other teams be able to do this season, maybe such as San Antonio. Incredible beating that, is going to kind of be, nobody's going to be able to match necessarily in that lower bracket, maybe with the exception of a Boston. And, a quad ball game that is, consistent, has some stars, maybe not quite cheat codes, but people who are going to be able to consistently get baskets. So, it's definitely, the possibility is definitely there. Jack, what do you think about that, about the idea of these South play-in teams?
Yeah, I'm certainly intrigued. These teams have shown a lot of promise this year. Very different teams. New Orleans, a very experienced squad, a tight-knit squad with a ton of chemistry. Kansas City, blending a couple different college programs, really young, just full of talent and explosiveness. I think I would have to hit the under on both of those teams making it out of the play-in bracket. I'm not. I think the odds are against them, and I think they're going to be going up against some teams that have not only experience but experience winning games in the play-in bracket. Not just one upset, but multiple games putting together a streak. Certainly the Charlotte Aviators, but Boston has been doing it, in the championship bracket for years. And the Minneapolis Monarchs have won games in the North Division the past couple seasons. So I think the muscle memory with winning, I think, is something that both New Orleans and Kansas City are going to be lacking in the play-in bracket.
And I do want to correct myself. Back in 2019, League City did also make the quarterfinals out of the play-in bracket. So that is my mistake. But definitely 2021, 2022, no South Division teams came out of the play-in bracket. Nick, I know I'm not going to make you steal your own Noah thunder later on, but what do you think of this Kansas City team and chances in the play-in bracket?
Yeah, I mean, it's totally possible we see Nola and Kansas City playing each other for that second play-in spot. I mean, if you look at the rosters that are public now, Nola's only bringing 12, I think, maybe 13, but they only brought 13 to this Super Series, and it's a lot of the same 13. I think that we talk about like the as Jack says, the muscle memory of winning. I don't see a ton of muscle memory of winning in the day one of MLQ championship throughout the bottom bracket here. I mean, Minneapolis, we talk about going through and sort of just like flaming out in the quarterfinals a lot of times, having to play here. And I mean, Boston, obviously, plenty of muscle memory winning there. But I do think that it is an interesting opportunity for either of these teams. Totally possible to see either of them playing late into the morning on day one, possibly against each other.
Awesome. So our first few storylines have been a bit more general. Let's start talking about a few teams more specifically. Jack, I'm going to throw the next storyline your way.
Yeah, and it's an easy transition to talking about Boston. My storyline is will Lulu Shu and Max Havlin make Boston competitive again. I think it's one of the most interesting storylines to watch. This Boston team has really struggled this year. It's their worst ever finish in terms of regular season record. We are so unused to watching Boston not just dominate the East Division. And there's a simple explanation. They haven't had Lulu Shu. They haven't had Max Havlin until the last series. Now they kind of get their anchors back, two of the best beaters of all time. Can they put together one last magical run and kind of cement their place in history with not only a run out of the play-in bracket, but carrying this Boston team maybe to a win over Austin or even an upset in the quarterfinals if they land against New York, which I think is a somewhat more favorable matchup. This is a chance I see for Lulu Shu and Max Havlin to really cement their legacies.
Yeah, I think the biggest concern with all that is obviously, we have not seen the two of them play together yet this season. They've each played series. They've just played them separately so far this year because of injuries that were suffered at different times. But, in that Washington series, we did get to see Max Havlin playing with Serena Montero. And, I'm not going to say that, anybody's going to pair up with Max Havlin as effectively as Lulu Shu. They've been doing it for a very long time. But the results a lot of the time were there. And, we've long been talking about the concept of a Max Havlin goal where Max Havlin does all the work and the quad ball player just puts the ball through the hoop. And, they say you can lead a horse to water, and it kind of felt like those were some of the non-scored Max Havlin goals in that Washington series. As good as Havlin and Shu can be, I think we might have to see something from this quad ball game if this Boston team is going to kind of make those, legacy-defining wins as you were putting them. Nick, what do you think about it?
Yeah, I think legacy defining is really strong at this point. I think their legacy is already well defined at this point. How can you not have a well defined legacy when you're arguably one of the best beater pairs, if not the best beater pair, for almost the entirety of the modern era of quad ball at this point? But I think that if we're talking about it, this is a chance for this Boston beater core as a whole to assert their dominance all the way through the quarterfinals, up to the quarterfinals, right? If this Boston team comes through and just there's a lot of beaters in this lower bracket to start with, right? I mean, we've already talked about Josh Mansfield and Alex Pucciarelli. We have the Cody Narvison, Gracie Johnson pair on Minneapolis. We have the Ryan Shu and Ray Brodeur pair in Detroit. And plenty of depth in the beating core on Charlotte. If they go through and just dominate all the way through to the quarterfinals, regardless of the matchup there, I mean, they are easily one of the top, if not the top beater pair coming into the quarterfinals in that grouping. I do think that there's that. But overall, I think it's making Boston competitive in those quarterfinals that this beater core will have to sort of set up, right? This is a Boston team that doesn't want to play in half court sets right now. This is a Boston team that wants to get out in transition. And all of these elite teams in the quarterfinals that they're going to face, if they get there, are transition-based teams as well. Like they are great transition defensive teams. So I think that it's going to come down to the beaters being able to play lights out and create those easy scoring opportunities for this Boston Quadball core if they're going to be competitive in the quarterfinals and onward.
Yeah, I think if you wanted to push back on your comment about well-defined legacies, we were talking, I think, before the show about how Augustine Monroe and Casey Irwin kind of got a championship last year that was kind of a workman-like championship where maybe the roster wasn't as flush with Team USA players left, right, and center as it was in some of their other titles. And they probably kind of title they haven't had to win since back in their UT days in college. You can't tarnish, where they rank among beaters. But if you want to talk about legacies and kind of getting those late career victories, a lot of those victories did come with absolutely stacked quadball talent. I mean, quadball players that are still making Team USAs in other programs that don't have that kind of beating talent. Players like, Tyler Trudeau and Julia Bear, players like Jake Archibald, who's obviously retired at this point, and then obviously very good seeker games as well in a world where, flag runner grabs meant a lot more, this pre-end game world. So, again, I'm not sure how much I even feel about staying behind this point, but I think if you wanted to argue about, the value of making a legacy push, doing it in that more workmanlike way, I think would be interesting to see. But I think we've kind of talked about that one enough. Let's go to another East Division team. Nick, I'll throw to you for the next one.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty obvious, right? Can Washington contend for a title at this point? We saw a Washington team come out and honestly get run off their home field by New York to start week one. This was a team that we thought was going to be one of the teams that was best going to use the new no resets rule, that was going to use its chaser athleticism. And it took them a while to figure that out, I think. We saw spurts of it throughout the year, but we really saw it in the last couple weeks. Whether it was with Boston, right, where we talk about these, we just talked about, right, the Havlin-Montero pair was almost lights out throughout this entire series, and it didn't result in these opportunities for these Boston Chasers. And that's because this Washington team can play in transition. This Washington team wants to put dodgeballs on the ground now, and they're even adding Nathan Morton to this beater core, who, like, at that point, right, do you really want to put dodgeballs on the ground? And if you do, even if you do, like, that's still a great player to do it at this point. Adrian Koretsky has taken the leap and now is a very, very consistent option for this team. I would not be surprised to see a Koretsky-Morton pair out there to just put dodgeballs on the ground and cause some chaos for this team. And then they're just finding the options around there. Plus, they have a seeking game at this point. Right, TJ Jennerett, we talk about not necessarily an elite seeker, but definitely in the discussion of that second tier right now, for sure. And maybe even kicking into that first tier. You want to talk about teams that have won championships. It's teams that can catch flag runners at this point. And that question is finally answered for Washington. Now, if they can put it all together, right, it's going to take a lot of work. They're going to come up against some of the best beating cores in the world at this point. But I definitely think they have a chance. It's way bigger than previous years. I think they're going to have to work against this Toronto team. I think this is a team that has the potential to come out slow, especially after in their most recent iteration, never having to come out of a play-in bracket, or they warmed up through the play-in bracket and then come in to play this Austin team, quite frankly. But if they can come out firing right away, get those 2 quick wins, I think that coming into the semifinals, they have a potential to upset this Austin or this Boston team that comes out of potentially the other side.
Yeah, and you kind of mentioned the beater core, and it's definitely a changed and redefined beater core. I think the consistent steps that Bernie Burgess and Katrina Hicks have been taking as a pair in recent seasons has been astounding, and it bared out in the stats basically in every series this season. Anytime they were getting the big wins, they were the ones with the good plus minuses. They were the ones who were taking on the team's number one beating pairs and, getting at least parity. As you said, sometimes it just fall on the ground. But the reason they can do that is because this quad ball game is incredibly deep. in a way that I think you could even argue amongst the top contending teams, Austin, New York. I'm not sure I would make the argument that they have deeper quad ball games. And it's a huge shout out to this coaching staff. When we had Keegan Remy Miller on earlier in the season, they stressed that, last year, this Washington team got caught in a position where they weren't confident kind of playing through their depth, and their top line started getting tired in that Austin series. And that is not this team, because, if you look at the stats from that Boston win, one of the biggest wins in program history, it was not, necessarily the Tyler Trudeau's and the Julia Bears putting up the huge stats. It was the Shane McConaughey leading the team in scoring. It was David Littleton being everywhere in that pitch as a wing option. And, if this team can just kind of play through that depth and really push teams and play at a high pace, and you mentioned dodgeballs on the ground, and, if you need a beater who's not going to be scared of any beater across the field from them because he's beaten them before and is going to be great at putting dodgeballs on the ground, it's Nathan Morton. And, I know Australia didn't have a good run at World Cup this year, but he is the player that popped if you watch them. And, the rumors I've heard from camp, and, obviously camp rumors, are always what they are. He's been popping off there. And I think, again, this team doesn't need to go out and dominate dodgeball games. A team like Boston is going to need to go out and dominate dodgeball games if they're going to win games. If this team's getting to parity, they might have the best quadball game in the game. Jack, what do you think?
Yeah, my concern, most likely if you're Washington, you're going to play Austin in the semifinals, the team that you've struggled to beat. And my concern is, even if you put dodgeballs on the ground, you're successful in that. Nathan Morton comes in, makes a huge difference. Are you going to have the defensive physicality to stay with Austin? I mean, you're dealing with players like Luis Sanchez, Andrew Axtell. You're dealing with Josh Johnson, and that's before you even start to chase around Miguel Esparza, a single season all-time leading scorer. So, yeah, Washington can play in transition, but are their chasers going to be able to stop Austin? That's my big question.
I have one name for you, and it's arguably the best point defender at this tournament in Brian Mulcahy. Brian Mulcahy is a defensive force, recognizes the situations, and does not overcommit. The number one time these Austin teams have won in these no dodgeball situations is where teams' point defenders overcommit trying to make the tackle. And Brian Mulcahy is smart enough to know that he is going to stand pat at the top of the key and not let these Austin chasers run around on him. I mean, Miguel Esparza is definitely a question mark, but Miguel Esparza is a question mark for every team, right, to stop this. But these big driving threats, there's no one better in the game at stopping them than Brian Mulcahy. And if Tyler Trudeau is healthy, that around hoops defense is going to be rock solid.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a fun team to watch for sure. I'll jump in with the next storyline, and it's about something that I've been fooled on many a time through the years. Is this new North different than every other North? To steal the parlance of a famous Passover question. We've been here before. We've believed in North Division teams. We've been very hype about Minneapolis teams coming out of the North Division as undefeated champions. Nick once picked the Detroit Innovators as a hot take to make the semifinals of MLQ championship. But this division's tended to let us down. We haven't, it's been a long, long time since 2017 since we've seen a North Division team make a semifinal. No current North Division franchise has ever made it out of any play-in bracket format that we've had. So going all the way back to 2019, the Rochester Whiteout did do it in 2019, but obviously weren't with the division at the time. There's a lot of hype about a couple of the teams this year. I think a lot of people are hyped about seeing Minneapolis in the play-in bracket because every year they've just kind of been put in this situation where they've been in a really tough quarterfinal matchup, and that's the only way we get to see them. They don't get a chance to build up into that matchup. And so far, they haven't been able to win a game, losing once to Boston and once to San Antonio. And then, we have this Chicago team that's undefeated, that's been, the apple in everybody's eye. It's getting all the accolades, all the attention. And they have to go right in and play a San Antonio team that has spoiled this franchise's tournaments in the past, and it would not be scared to do it again here. So, it'll be interesting to see. I have my concerns because we've seen it before that the pace of play and the style of play in the North doesn't necessarily translate once these teams show up for the main tournament. For Chicago, I mean, San Antonio is a really, really good team. And if there's any criticism of Chicago's beautiful run through the North Division this season, it's that I think their defense did have some holes. It's just that maybe some of the North Division opposition weren't necessarily the ones to take advantage of it. But a player like Jay Stewart is a player that is going to take advantage of holes in the defense. And it's not just Jay. It's the fact that this team can pass around the press because they're so deep in the quad ball game. Players like Moena Sousa, so comfortable on ball. Matt Blackwood, David Avila. And, it's a team that, they should have a dodgeball advantage, but are they going to be able to press it enough to make it count to force the upset? There's no DME on the Chicago team, so they're going to need other players to step up. And they have, in fairness, again, had players step up all season long. But, that's what we'll have to see. And for this Minneapolis team, every year they get to championships and the beating game kind of gets away from them. That's the story we've seen over and over again. And, lucky for them, they don't have to see Boston early, but they do have to see Charlotte early. And Charlotte is a deep beating team. And, to get out of the playing bracket, they're probably going to have to bring a NOLA. They're probably going to have to play NOLA, who has great beating court. We talked about Charlotte. I mean, they may have to see Boston. They're probably going to have to beat one or two of those teams if they hope to actually make it to the quarterfinals. And then, beyond that, we've got a team like Detroit, who, had a kind of a slower, I think, North Division championships than I think a lot of us thought they would. Still without Julian Toyarkov, so big questions still in the offense. We know, Jack Levy's also been playing through injury. And then, a Toronto team that really had that real rough North Division championship as well, where they just weren't able to hang with Chicago at all. And now we're going to have to go up against a Washington team that obviously we were just hyping up. So, it'll be interesting to see. Can this North be any different? Jack, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, the pieces have certainly been in place during the regular season. I think all the teams in the North have made progress. And this is a home championship, MLQ championship for the North, where teams are driving. And it's a closer distance. I think the elephant in the room is no DME for the Chicago Prowl, the division champions, the team that we've had the highest hopes for. That's a really big loss. I mean, they are a deep team. I was saying that last week. They can certainly still beat San Antonio. I think it's 50-50. I think the North has to show up this year. This is multiple teams are coming in with momentum in the right direction, whether it's Detroit building on what the University of Michigan did at the college national championship, whether it's the growth we've seen from the Minneapolis beater core this season, the performance of Team Canada at World Cup. I think all these teams are in a position to perform well, but we just can't believe it until we see it. They have to actually back it up with their performance on the field.
Nick, anything you want to add on this point?
Yeah, I am. I mean, I agree. No DME is a big loss for Chicago, but at this point, right? It's if we're talking about players that can step up in his place, it's time for Nathan Digman to step up, right? Nathan Digman has long been on the cusp of that elite player question mark area, an excellent distributor, a really creative player option. I mean, there's plenty of other players that can step up, right? Byron Eng for that Rutgers program can step up. But if we're looking for someone to sort of fill that, where realistically Chicago's been playing DME behind the hoops a lot and letting DME sort of attack this 2-2 zone from its vulnerable location, Digman has shown flashes of that. And if this team wants to compete at a high level, they need him to attack in that direction. I do think the Minneapolis is arguably being underrated because of their North Division championship performance. They did get the bid they came to get. However, this was a team that was missing key players, right? They were missing Alex Obanor. They were missing Joe Goulet. They were missing Gracie Johnson. those are three names that were key for this Minneapolis team throughout its prior situations. And I think that plus the seeking of Henry Bear Benson are going to be keys for this. I'm not necessarily saying that they'll win a game if they make it out into the quarterfinals, but I think we're going to see a vastly different Minneapolis team than the one we saw at North Champs.
Yeah, and I think as much as I don't think a lot of us like the matchup that Toronto has found itself in, this has been a Toronto roster that's kind of been slowly getting more complete over time as the season goes on. Getting a player like Zach McDonald in who has been making a big impact, pairing up with Emma Sherwood, who's also been a stalwart for this team so far this season. And, seeing the play, as these players come together, some of these players that, I think we really think can make a difference. A player like Brian Melchior, who was so big early in the season, a player like Levi Medeiros, who was so big, in those bright spots for this team against Chicago a couple weeks ago. So I think the mountain's going to be heavier for them more than anybody else. I think the expectations of the North is least on their backs, but this isn't a team that's going to go down lightly either. This is a team full of people who have dominated the sport, in their country at their levels and have a history of winning. And we've talked so much about how much a history of winning matters in this sport. I think it'll kind of be fun to watch all of these North Division teams play. And I just want to say really quick on the Chicago point that, I mentioned kind of defense, and, Jack was talking about the concerns about Washington, and, you have to hit in these big games. And that's the thing I most need to see out of Chicago. I think they'll run a smart offense. I think they'll run a good offense. But, not a ton of players known for their physicality, and, players that, we've seen kind of step up into big roles in this team, players like Emma Vasquez and Ali Manzella. I mean, they're going to need to play lockdown defense in some of these matchups, if they're hoping to shut down all the off-ball talent that San Antonio has, because San Antonio is going to find ways to, put them in ISOs with Jay Stewart, or make them be the person who's covering, in a triangle and one, if that's something they try to run on Jay Stewart. And they're going to have to step up in the way that we've seen players like Lindsay Morella and Julia Baer step up as defenders in big moments in big games. I think those are the kind of small things that might make the difference for this team, more so than can this team create offense, because I really am confident that even against the best in the world, this team knows how to create offense. Jack, staying in that matchup, I think your next take stays there as well.
Yeah, it is. My take is San Antonio being dangerously underrated? Now, I know I was advocating for Chicago to pick San Antonio, so let me explain myself. I think it was still the right pick, but I think this San Antonio team is not one to be underestimated. San Antonio has a young core that just won a national championship with the University of Texas San Antonio. All they've done is win. They're 3 for 3 on making the semifinals at MLQ championships. They've never gotten eliminated at the quarterfinal stage, no matter who has rostered. Seemingly every year, there's someone big who's missing on that San Antonio roster. To our knowledge, right now, they look full strength to me. I think when I was advocating for Chicago to go with the San Antonio pick, I was pointing towards their weaknesses in the beating game. And I still think that's, where Chicago can impose their will. But they're going to have to deal with one of the hottest beaters in the sport right now. Chris De La Fuente has been so good this season. So I think the San Antonio team very well could be back in the semifinals if Chicago isn't careful.
Yeah, I mean, I think my criticism early season of a lot for the season San Antonio is, is this team going to be able to face off against a team that has a dodgeball advantage against it? And I think, like you spoke, they've answered those questions to a good degree. I mean, Chris De La Fuente is playing incredibly well, has been all season. Javi Tijerino coming up from that San Antonio program, has making big strides as well. But, other players, Brandy Sanchez, who just won Player of the Week for that League City series, was so important for the team in that series. It just seems like this is a team that's been able to develop so quickly and so effectively. And like you said, they just don't really know how to lose. And, even a bunch of them played for that DA that didn't know how to lose against prior World Cup champions like Australia. So that's just kind of written in the DNA. It's something we've talked about a million times. I don't think this team's going to play with any fear against the Chicago team. That much is for sure. And I think, the big question will be, can a player like Matt Brown just take over the series? And if they can't, I think the quad ball game, I think there's a lot to be said for San Antonio in that series. Nick, what's your take on all of it?
Yeah, I mean, my take is Matt Brown is the hottest player in the world right now. At this point, I mean, we talk about there are probably beaters better than him in the world right now at this point, but there aren't beaters hotter than him right now. I mean, when you're posting plus 20s in your plus minuses, I don't really think you can play with a lack of confidence at this point. I think we talk about a team that plays with confidence. I think that the Chicago team is a team that plays with confidence. This is a Chicago team that is acting differently than maybe some of the North teams coming in the past. I think this is going to be a fireworks series. I think that San Antonio does have a chance to get out of that quarterfinals, and I think it's a good chance at this point. I think it's at best 60-40. You can decide which way it is that way, but I don't think you're going any lower than that for either side. I'm super excited to see what the San Antonio team does. Because if there's one thing Chicago is smart. I think San Antonio has definitely sort of found its success against teams that play less than intelligent defenses on them at this point, right? We've seen New Orleans play that not even triangle and one, just that at all costs Jay Stewart doesn't do cool things situation. And if anyone's willing to do that, I think it's the Chicago team. Against this. I mean, I think we're going to see close games. I think the rest of the San Antonio core is strong enough to make that opportunity a chance if you're not getting the production you normally get from Jay Stewart. But the Chicago team's going to come out with a plan for this San Antonio team, and it's a question of can this San Antonio team answer?
Yeah, and I think the last thing to really talk about in this matchup, which I think one of the reasons we've talked about now through multiple points, is it's definitely one of the most exciting matchups, I think, of the season, of the tournament. Probably, especially with the history tied into it, probably one of the most, of MLQ history. It's really fun to watch it play out every time. The one thing we haven't talked about is the flag runner game. It's a place where Chicago's been completely invisible. I believe one catch on the season so far. And obviously, Jay Stewart is a great seeker. Interesting to see how San Antonio plays it, because Jay Stewart's also their biggest threat to score in flag runner and pitch. If they're so confident they can win that game with even one of their other seekers, do they keep Jay in the quad ball game, or do they, use Jay as a seeker, rest him up for a few minutes before flag runner and pitch? Those are kind of the interesting strategic decisions that'll have to be made. But I think we should move on from this matchup. But we are going to stay in the South Division. Nick, give us your next storyline.
Yeah, I mean, it's one that I've been talking about all season long, right? I think I've probably been the most critical of them on this program. It's can Austin get out of first gear? At this point, we've seen an Austin team that is defensively questionable. They've had no problems playing the high press against League City. But that's, again, right, we talk about beater advantages. The disadvantages that League City had early in the season, right? It was their first series out against an Austin squad that has played so many minutes together, whether it's at the international level or at this MLQ level or even at the USQ level. You're going to see pressing opportunities. I think the biggest thing that I'm worried about right now is what does this Austin team do when it faces a team that is coming out firing from the start? This Austin team is definitely the biggest struggle we've seen against this Austin team is a New Orleans team that came out from the start ready to play against them and played smart against them. They didn't take away Jay Stewart at all in their San Antonio series, which even if you're saying we're just going to go in and play our game, we're going to see what happens, you have to sell out against Jay Stewart, right? You watch the San Antonio team, you know that everything runs through him. It's a team that I think has a lot of question marks on the defensive end. Jack's talked about the physicality of these players. We haven't seen it in this MLQ season. We've seen a little bit of it at the international level too, but it's still a question mark in this MLQ season. If Jackson and Bailey play like they played in Jackson, Johnson, and Bailey Fields play like they played in the international game, I don't know how much of it matters, but it is really a question of there's just a lot of questions around this Austin team. And if they can't get out of first gear against a Washington team that wants to put balls on the ground, right, arguably a strength of this Austin team, is their beater core and their ability to press the advantage in that world. Can they hang with some of these more elite teams, the New Yorks, the Chicagos, the Washingtons of the world? It might not matter till the final, but if they can't get out of first gear against some of these elite teams, I think we're going to see problems for this Austin team.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked on the show before about the lazy defensive rotations, but really, I mean, you could say that outside of a little bit of pressing early in the season, the strategic innovations haven't been there for this team as they have for teams like New York and like Chicago, who seem like they're trying to push this rule book to its fullest, and Washington to their credit as well. This is a team playing 2-2s and playing, hoop zone, and that's basically what we're seeing from them. This team's still playing a lot of boxes on offense. Slow, patient, methodical play. I mean, these are all things we've come to learn, expect from Austin. That said, there's a lot of counterpoints to that too. We've seen players in this core before wait for championships to break out that strategic innovation. How many times on the USQ side have we seen players on this team lose dramatically in a February game only to run away with championships a few months later? And to that point, this Austin team has lost games to San Antonio in the regular season before and just come out and won championships off of that. They didn't even do that this year, obviously. This team also still hasn't had – this team has all 6 players that were starting for Team USA in the finals 5 of 6. And those players have not all been on a roster so far for this team yet this season. It's been combinations of them. So maybe we haven't seen the fullest Austin when it comes to roster. Maybe we haven't seen the fullest Austin when it comes to strategy, but we're not going to know that until we get there. And we might not really know that until, they're facing a team like Washington that, as Nick was saying, can come out hard, and this Austin team has been a little slow. So I guess, Jack, my question for you is less about will they get out of first gear, because we can only speculate on that. But my question is, can this team win the championship in first gear?
Yeah, I think they can. It's not a super original take, but I've been high on this Austin team all season. That doesn't change for me. I've seen Josh Johnson play as the best player at last year's MLQ championship. The year before, it was Andrew Axtell or Luis Sanchez. Take your pick. So this team has the pieces, and I don't think they have to be clicking on all cylinders, firing on all cylinders to take home the Benepe Cup and complete the first three-peat in MLQ history. My questions with the Outlaws revolve around their defense at the hoops. Can they stand tall? Can they stop drives? I think that's where my concern would lie. And yeah, I think Austin is as well prepared to win this tournament as any tournament they've attended since we came back from the pandemic.
Yeah, and for as much as I was just critical about them, I mean, as you were kind of alluding to, if Jackson Johnson and Bailey Fields can play like the 2 best beaters on the planet, we talked about how that isn't necessarily enough for Boston right now, but that is literally Miguel Esparza's dream. And we've seen what Esparza's been able to do with that all season, breaking the single season goal record in the league, scoring 5 goals a game this season. And, we talk about cheat codes. There might not be a bigger one in the sport than Miguel Esparza in transition, especially in no dodgeball situations. And Jackson Johnson and Bailey Fields are very good at creating those. But we'll also have to see, what the depth looks like in this beater game, what the lines look like, how this team's going to work their way through those lines. That could be decisive as well. But we should jump on to our next point here. And Jack, I'll throw it back to you for the next one.
Yeah, my question is, should anyone be surprised if New York runs the table? I mean, this is a core that just won the club national championship with the Warriors. It was the best, most consistent chasing core for the U.S. national team at World Cup. Why should we expect anything less of the Titans than to finally get the job done and win a Benepe Cup? They picked apart Boston, which is still a strong defensive team for all their issues on offense. This Boston team has a lot of very good tacklers. They cover the hoops well. Lindsey Morella was just picking out passes all weekend, and Boston had no answer, and they beat Washington without her. This is a New York team that has so much talent. The beating core is as deep as it's ever been, and it's competing at and its ceiling, I think, is higher than it's ever been. It's competing at a really high level. I give me the Titans all day to give Austin a really tough match in the finals.
Yeah, I think this New York team has proven a lot over the last couple of years. I think it does start with the beating core because it has taken that step where I think it is one of the most feared beating cores, and made a Boston beating core that was not whole. Obviously, no Max Havin or Louis Shu for that series, but it made it look bad in that series, and it kind of did the same thing to Washington. And Washington isn't necessarily known for its beater core, but as we were talking about, a lot of strides have been made, and there's just been no answer for the spurts of ridiculous energy that are the Devin Lee shifts. There's been no answers for just consistency in this team's ability to be all over the field with their dodgeballs, playing these high presses at the midline, but also not giving up dodgeball control for doing it. And this is a team that's kind of been pushing for strategic innovation. For we're going to run a mark and 3 trees and a 2-2 and a triangle and 1 all in a single game. And we've talked about that. In quadball, it's not always about having the best strategy. It's about having the strategy that's catching your opponent off guard. And a team that's that comfortable, being able to mix things up. And that's not even talking about this first line, this almost completely Team USA first line. John Jackson, who's been such a stalwart, who is one of the best no dodgeball half court finishers in the sport, which is such a privilege to have, especially when your dodgeball game's that good. A player like Lindsey Morella, who's taken insane steps on the defensive end in this team's press and in this team's triangle and 1. I'm not sure they could run either defense fully without her. I mean, and that's not to short Molly Potter, who I think is taking big steps as defense as well, but Morella is just constantly in these passing lanes, making things so difficult for the opposition. And so, this is a really, really talented New York team. And I think, and this is in part because they won the East Division, and that's the privilege that comes with it, but definitely drawing, I think, the better bracket. We would expect them to dodge Boston, who's a team that, even though they did sweep, I'm sure they wouldn't want to see again in the quarterfinals. And then, this Chicago and San Antonio is going to have to play a really competitive series on Saturday night, like we've been talking about, and then have to run into this New York team Sunday morning. It'll be interesting to see. Nick, what do you think of this New York team?
Yeah, I think they're arguably the favorites at this point. We just talked about Austin's first gear question marks. This New York team is not playing in first gear. This New York team, you can say like, oh, they have whatever, they've put everything they have on tape. What they've put on tape is a lot. You don't know what they're going to come out with offensively or defensively at this point. This is a team that is making the most of the rule set. This is a team that is playing so many different defenses that I think that's honestly, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, but I think that's a big feather in their cap, right? If so many teams cross the half court without taking stock of what defense the other team is playing. We saw Chicago do it against Toronto. We've seen Austin do it against San Antonio. We've seen Boston do it against everyone, whether it's Washington, New York, or Charlotte at this point. It's a thing that I think that this team is going to use to its advantage. And almost everyone on this team starting line is a cheat code at some level, right? It's if you need a bucket, they can go get a bucket, or they can find the assist to make that happen. And I think that this team really has an opportunity to make a really special run.
Yeah, I think for sure. So I'm going to get into the last storyline before we go to our hot takes. And this one is kind of playing into what we were just talking about, the way this New York team has been so strategically innovative. And my question is, are the strategic innovations going to be the difference maker? And are they going to be the ones we've already seen this regular season? Or is there going to be more to come? We've talked about how, players like this Austin core love to bring in the strategic innovation at championship, leave it in the back pocket until then. We just saw for the first time, Chicago executing basically a full court press. Teams will sometimes press all the way up to the the full court if the other team has no dodgeballs. But this was more of a by design, full court press that absolutely overwhelmed Toronto in that North Division, especially game one of that North Division championship final. So, can a team, kind of stick with what's been working in recent years in other rule sets? Or is this going to come down to just a space race for who can, make the last strategic innovation, make the last adjustment, outflank the team one last time, be it in a final or a semifinal, and that being the difference. Jack, what do you think about that?
Yeah, strategy is moving so fast. It's no doubt going to play a huge part here. What I'm looking for is, to what extent can teams really disguise the looks that they're giving on defense? Like, teams are moving in the direction of American football style defenses. And a key to success there is to make sure when the other team is crossing half field, they think you're playing a defense that you're not actually playing. And teams are already doing this, but it's something that I'm definitely going to be watching for, and I think it could be decisive this weekend.
Nick, anything you want to add there?
Jack stole my point, right? It's disguised coverages. And I don't necessarily know if we're going to see a ton of that this coming weekend, but it is definitely the way the league is going as a whole. I think the ability is not so much disguised coverages as it is to recognize when the other team is running something in transition out of that coverage quickly, is what we'll see this weekend. I don't necessarily think we're going to see a disguised 2-2 or disguised 3 trees into a mark opportunity as soon as we get it. I think we're going to see, okay, this team can play the breaker principles against us, right? If that's the case, then we're going to transition into a mark defense, or we're going to pick off the mark pass. It's going to be understanding what the tendencies of the offense are and playing the defense to break those tendencies.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And it's going to be a fun X's and O's type weekend, which I think, we haven't necessarily seen in a couple of years. I think Austin brought back the Baylor Zone basically in 2021's championship. And that's kind of been the meta, along with some 2-2 for a couple of years now. And things have really taken a turn. And now it's going to be interesting to see how that all plays out. So with our 9 storylines out of the way, it's time for hot takes. We're each going to give one. You'll have the floor for a monologue, and there'll be no rebuttals. We will just move on to the next one. We will start with Nick. Nick, give us your hot take for the 2023 MLQ Championship.
The New Orleans Curse will get out of the play-in. They'll make the quarterfinals. We've talked about it. There's an elite beater pair at this point in Josh Mansfield and Alex Pucciarelli. There are 2 teams in this play-in bracket that play elite seekers at this point, right? And New Orleans isn't one of those teams, but New Orleans is an elite flag runner on pitch team at this point, at this level. They are a team that arguably dominated San Antonio in the flag runner on pitch game and gave up 1 moment. Now, 1 moment might be all those elite seekers need, but it might not be enough for the other 2. This is a team, right? They're bringing 12 people, 13 people. This is a team that brought 12, 13 to a super series, right? And gave Austin a game. And they're bringing that same 12, 13 pretty much to this championship. This is a team, I think, that is a scary team no matter how many numbers are on the field at this point. This is a team that brought next goal wins looks against San Antonio and against Kansas City. I think that we talk about the potential for the development of winning. It has to start somewhere, right? And I think it starts this weekend here for New Orleans.
All right, Jack, your turn.
I love Nick riding with his former city, New Orleans. Much respect for that. My hot take is going to be, and bear with me for a second here, Minneapolis to win the second most games at the MLQ Championship. Now, I'm not going to go totally into the math here, but if they get out of the play-in bracket after having lost 1 game, which I think is realistic, and then win at least 1 game in the quarterfinals, then they will be at 5 wins. And 5 wins would be a number that you could only pass as a team coming through the championship bracket if you won a game in the finals. I think that's going to be a tall task. Minneapolis, I just really like what they've done this year. I think their beating game has taken a leap. I've loved what Nathan Podolsky, Joe Blanchard, Ben Schluter have been doing behind the kind of headline pair of Gracie Johnson and Cody Narveson that's been so good for so long. I think they are playing at a much faster pace, and I think they're much more likely to be able to hang with beaters from other regions who are also playing at that faster pace. In the quadball game, it looks like they have their full complement of players. They have all their weapons. They have the passing of Terry Carlson, the speed of Max Meyer, the driving of OB. At different times the past couple years, they've been missing one of those pieces or another. So I think everything is kind of coming together here for the Monarchs. They've flown under the radar. They didn't win the North Division this year, and they're playing close to home in West Des Moines, Iowa, a neighboring state. Give me the Monarchs. I'm excited about what they can do.
Right. And my hot take, I think we've kind of tiptoed around it at times as we've been talking through our storylines, but mine will be the Washington Admirals will make the finals. Now, Washington's hurt me before, many a time when I've been high on this team, but I think this is such a different Washington team. I mean, we talk about Washington teams that were struggling to, get out of the bottom half of the East Division in some of these years through the years, and kind of the turnaround that's happened in recent years, going toe-to-toe with Austin last year in the quarterfinals, a 2-1 loss, and then finishing second in the East Division this year for just the second time ever. And it's all the things we've talked about. It's the depth of the quadball game. It's the steps that the beaters have taken in the dodgeball game, all kind of coming together. And like you said, finally having a seeker answer in TJ Generate. You talk about how this team could match up with this Austin team. Let's say that Austin doesn't have the strategic innovations to bring out this year. If this Washington team is going to see 2-2s and Baylor zones, this Washington team is going to be ecstatic because they know how to break down those defenses. These are veteran players. You kind of talk about the shock of playing up against an Austin. I think when you see a team like KC get absolutely wiped by them in the regular season, I think that's intimidation. I think that's, not being able to feel like you're eye to eye level with this team. There's no way this Washington team has even a grain of that. These are veteran players. These are Team USA players. These are players that have been on the pitch with these Austin players so many times, both on a team with and against. I mean, a player like Rachel Heald was playing with most of this, Austin first line just a month ago at IQA World Cup. These teams will know each other well. And in those moments, it can be the small things sometimes that can matter. It can be a flag runner pool, which I think we would all probably agree Washington's probably favored in that area of the game. It could be, just having the players who are going to make the big play in moments. There's cheat codes. David Littleton's playoff ball in that Boston series was a bit of a cheat code. Even small things, deeper in the rotation for their quadball games. John Gaffigan's shots still sometimes can be a cheat code. And this Washington team is going to come out hard and fast. Austin is possibly not going to have a ton of, things to deal with before this Washington team. And I think this Washington team might catch them a little off guard, especially in that first game. And they're not going to be tired like they have been the last few times they've played Austin. And I think they know where they need to be. Beating Toronto and making the semifinals will already be the furthest the Admirals have ever made it at an MLQ championship. But I don't think this team will be satisfied with that. I don't think they need to be satisfied with that. I think this Washington team can make the finals of MLQ championship. So that will do it for our preview episode for the 2023 MLQ championship in Des Moines, Iowa. We hope you will be joining us there because it's going to be an incredible tournament. But if you can't, we will be streaming all weekend long on the MLQ page here on YouTube from both pitches, along with the tournament, which will be Saturday with Saturday night quarterfinals and then Sunday with the semifinals and finals. We will also have the Next Gen series contested between practice squad players from our East Division teams and practice squad players from our North Division teams. That will be happening on Sunday during the semifinals on pitch 2. And then on Monday, we have Take Back the Pitch, a fantasy tournament featuring exclusively female and players outside of the gender binary. Always a really fun event for us all to watch alongside and kind of help volunteer at. Like we said, it's going to be our last episode of MLQ Replay for the season. We want to thank you for taking the time to be watching all season. for myself, Nick, and Jack. We do appreciate it. Also to Harry Clark, who's been our producer behind the scenes all year long. We do really appreciate all of his hard work. We'll miss him at MLQ Championships this week, but hopefully we can get him back again next year. As always, check out the Patreon. We know the season's winding down, but there's still plenty of good content over there. But, you know, I'm not going to make you wait around here any longer because we're just 4 days away from MLQ Championship. We're so hyped. We hope you are as well. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in Des Moines.